Just 6 days into Duskmourn Standard, and we've had two big MTGO challenge events wherein Duskmourn has already had a huge effect on the format. So let's do it, everybody. Top 3 new decks of the week, week 1 of Duskmourn Standard, plus an honorable mention, which is on your screen right now, actually. This is Simic Beans by perennial MTGO grinder. Coffee is my co-pilot, who got 6th place in one of those challenges. But another grinder named Bernes Torres also got 10th place in a different challenge, so this deck is definitely on the rise right now. Let's see what it does. Now, you might have been staring at the Tolarian Terror on your screen for a while now and been having flashbacks to Mono Blue, and maybe you should, because the deck is a little bit like that deck. Just like Mono Blue, we're using a bunch of cheap instants and sorceries, fill our yard up real quick, and play these guys for super duper cheap. So in that way, it's very similar to Mono Blue, but that's about where the similarities stop. We are playing some counter spells, but we're not like a 20 counter spell deck. Now in this deck, the way we're reducing the cost of these guys right here, and we need to do that, we are not suckers, we understand the concept of value, is to play these little 1 mana instants and sorceries in green and blue like Analyze the Pollen, as well as Brave the Wilds, as well as Bushwhack. So 12 different spells that cost a single green mana and are capable of going and getting a land for us. Plus, these do other stuff. You know, Brave the Wilds can make a 3/3 out of one of our lands, Bushwhack can have one of our big boys fight something smaller than it, hopefully, and Analyze the Pollen is kind of cute with these big guys because, you know, it goes and gets a land in the early game, but if we somehow get one of these huge dudes into our graveyard, then we are most of the way there to just making this a creature tutor. Now, as far as the spells go in the deck, we've got 4 Cash Grab. We'll never actually hit the squirrel mode on this, but it doesn't actually matter. It's just instant speed, mill 4 cards. Now, that allows us to collect evidence with the Analyzed Pollen. It's a way to get those huge dudes into our yard so that we can collect evidence with the Analyzed Pollen. That's pretty cool. And it just makes sure that we can actually get important permanents to the deck, like the huge dudes, or Storm Chaser's Talent, or Up the Beanstalk. We'll talk about those in a second. Now, Get Out is the only brand new card in the main deck here, and it's a cool card, man. 2 mana for an instant, choose one, counter a creature or enchantment spell, or return 1 or 2 target creatures and or enchantments you own to your hand. There's plenty of reasons you might want to do that in this deck, right? Sometimes you'll be able to return both a Storm Chaser's Talent and an Up the Beanstalk to your hand, draw another card off the Up the Beanstalk, get an Otter, a Prowess Otter off of Storm Chaser's Talent. So those are pretty sick things to just bring back to your hand. But if you've already got Up the Beanstalk and, say, a Tolarian Terror in play, you just return both of those to your hand, play Up the Beanstalk, play Tolarian Terror, you're drawing a ton of cards. But it's also a little bit of defense, obviously. The only main deck counterspell in our Simic Tempo deck. Seems weird, but we've also got This Town Ain't Big Enough over here from OTJ. This is 5 mana for an instant that costs 3 less to cast if it targets a thing you control. Return up to 2 target non-land permanents to their owner's hands. So this is a lot like one of the modes on Get Out, but you can also interact with your opponent's stuff too. You know, if you want to return a Storm Chasers to your hand and, say, one of your opponent's mono-red creatures that just got 2 monstrous rage casts on it in the same turn, I guess you just pay 2 mana and return Storm Chasers and their guy to their hand, their Hardfire hero or whatever. So, pretty neat little application for this card. Between this and Into the Flood Maw, we actually have 8 different, like, bouncy tempo spells. And if we can just take our opponent, you know, off their game, put them on the back foot for the first, like, 3-4 turns of the game, then suddenly our board is full with giant crabs and, like, Tolarian Terrors and stuff. And the tempo got them. So, especially with all the card draw that we have in this deck. There's also Storm Chaser's Talent. I've, like, briefly talked about this card already, but it's really cool in this deck because we've got 8 different ways, 7 different ways really, of returning it to our hand and playing it again. But we can also return instants or sorceries from our yard to our hand. There's plenty of ways we want to do that just to get more value off of these instants and sorceries. Also, if we like used a Bushwhack in the early game, or, you know, Analyze the Pollen, well, now we can bring them back and use them as a removal spell or a creature tutor respectively. And those are awesome modes for level 2 on this. And obviously, you ever get to level 3, you just start getting a bunch of Otters, which is really awesome too. So kind of a late game sort of engine here that does a lot of stuff for the deck all throughout the game. But there's a couple of extra tricks in here. You may not have noticed how high the actual card count is in the deck, but it's really high. That's why we're only playing 16 lands. Now, remember that we're playing like 12 different effects that go search for a basic land. So far as we get any of those on turn 1, then we should get our second land, and the deck is just kind of fine. After it gets its second land, it would really like its third. but you can often just get another like 1 green mana thing and go get a land. So the deck doesn't have to play a very high land count at all. This is like the only 16 land deck in standard, and the first one I've seen in a really long time that was viable. It's worthy of note, but there is one more trick we don't want to miss in this deck, and that's the single mountain in the sideboard along with Lithomantic Barrage and 4 copies of Pyroclasm. Yeah, it seems really, really cute, doesn't it? It's because it is, but it's also pretty effective. I would assume, you know, like the mountain, it looks like 1 mountain, right? But even without Fabled Passages, that's actually 13 mountains. So really, really neat sideboard trick too with this deck. Just a lot of stuff going on here, especially for an honorable mention. But even with like the really 2 brand new cards and that's it throughout the main and sideboard, the deck is still brand new. We just haven't really seen too much like this in the recent, you know, past or anything. Is not the right word, but anyway, we haven't seen too much like this lately. I just thought the deck was really cool. Now, that last deck may not have had Haughty Djinn in it, but we're not safe from the Djinn for too long because there's a 4 of in the next deck we're going to look at. The number 3 deck of the week is one that a lot of us thought would be pretty powerful, but I guess we didn't know it would be this powerful. Norman Carr got a 18th place with this in the first challenge of the season, but again, perennial grinder, somebody that we've seen an awful lot around here lately is Makubi. They got a first place with this deck in the second MTGO challenge of the series, so the deck is obviously pretty good if it can just first place a challenge like that. Now, what does this deck actually do? It's a helping hand deck. You've seen those, right? You know, usually they play a Monastery Mentor in the same slot they're playing Abhorrent Oculus now, but Oculus is just so much better than Monastery Mentor in this slot. In case you haven't seen Oculus yet, it's from Duskmourn, 3 mana for a 5/5 flyer that you have to exile 6 cards from your yard to cast, but at the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, you get to manifest Dread. That's the set mechanic where you get a 2/2 and put a card in your yard. This seems like it would take a lot, right, to cast the spell. 6 cards from your yard? No, it only takes 1 mana to cast the spell, actually. The trick is not casting it. The trick is just bringing it back from your yard on like turn 2 or 3 or something like that. This deck seems really, really dangerous to me, even though it's not changing too much about its normal game plan. It's just adding Oculus, and I think that that's more than worth, you know, mentioning and being a little bit frightened about, because a lot of us, again, called this deck might be pretty good, and this is a confirmation of that. You've got your Haughty Djinn, your Picklock Prankster to mill yourself cards. Chart a Course will put cards into your yard, and also just draw cards is very good. Recommission. There's a 2 of in here as kind of a, you know, copies 5 and 6 of Helping Hand, and Sleight of Hand is also in this deck. It was in the last one as well. It's really, really good cantripping on turn 1. Into the Flood Maw is one of the better ways these decks have of just like tempoing out the mono red decks and taking care of like Deep Cavern Bats for a turn and like other early game plays that opponents are going to make. Soul Partition is also in here as a Deece removal spell, again, kind of tempo based. Right? We want to just put the game away in the couple of turns it would take them to recast their spell. Phantom Interference is our signature counter spell, along with 3 Steps Ahead, which can also copy an Oculus or a Haughty Djinn, which is a pretty ridiculous play. And then Moment of Truth can also put cards into our graveyard for us. So in this deck's case, there is no way of putting enough cards or, you know, into your yard, or of putting the Oculus into your yard on turn 1 that I see, at least, and then getting it on turn 2. But maybe I'm missing a trick. Yeah, Sleight of Hand puts the other one on the bottom. So yeah, it looks like you're mostly getting Oculus on turn 3 with this build, but that is not much of a problem, you know, so long as you can stave off the mono red threats, right? You probably blow out a lot of other mid-range decks, especially if you can untap with an Oculus in play and then protect it with counter spells and just keep drawing cards and stuff. So I just wanted you guys to be aware that this deck has first placed a tournament already. All of our fears about Oculus seem to have been founded. Last thing I want to say about this deck is just permission to call it hand-eye coordination. Helping Hand, Born Oculus, hand-eye coordinate. Think about it. I think it's a... Let's move to the next deck. Deck number 2 on the day is a little bit of the old and a little bit of the new. We're going to look at Xur's Overlords for this one. Kind of a domain deck. Kind of plays Xur out of nowhere. It's an old card that hasn't seen much love in a while, but it's really good. So what the heck are we doing here? Well, Xur works pretty much exactly the way you want him to. with, these new overlords, right? So basically you pay 2 mana if you have a Zur in play, and you can have a non-aura enchantment become a creature in addition to its other types. And now its base power and toughness are equal to its mana value. Well, Overlord of the Hauntwoods and Overlord of the Mistmoors are not creatures if you play them with Impending, right? So if you have a Zur in play and you pay 2 mana, you can just turn Overlord of the Mistmoors into a 7/7 hexproof lifelink death touch that whenever it attacks, you get the 2/1 flyers. That seems gross. And then like Overlord, you can make Overlord a 5/5 that whenever it attacks you ramp or whatever. And all that's really, really good. And again, hexproof death touch, lifelink, all that. So Zur is a really neat combo with the Overlords. And it's pretty sick to see these cards all in a package in a deck that actually did fairly well. I think it was Lucas Dusek got 2nd place in an MTGO challenge with this deck, so that seems pretty real. But Gracias Portanto also got 21st place in a different MTGO challenge with a very similar version of this deck. So again, different results entirely, but when you see 2nd place, you have to start, paying attention. You got Tranquil Thrillback as a sort of pre-boarded card. You've got Herd Migration and Sunfall, so again, very similar cards to the stuff that we would see in a lot of these domain decks. Analyze the Pollen, that's kind of neat. If you can collect evidence, and there's plenty of expensive cards in the deck, right? So if you can collect evidence, you can go get an Overlord or a Zur, and I think that's pretty neat right there. Or Anoint with Affliction, the removal spell of choice, which I think is kind of neat in this deck. The End is another decent removal spell, and then 2 Virtue of Persistence, which if it ends up in your graveyard can collect evidence pretty well, but it's also just a good way of gaining life in the early game against decks like Mono Red and having a nice late game sort of backup plan. But that's not all the cards in this deck. There's also 2 copies of Kaya Intangible Slayer, which I guess replaces the other 2 copies of Atraxa that would normally be in the 7-drop. And then a copy of Jace, which can mill cards of your own, I guess, into your yard if you want to do it that way, and then get them out with Invasion of Tilvada. There's not a whole lot of ways of dumping creatures into your own yard in this deck to then be reanimated. Like, I don't see a whole lot of ways of dumping an Atraxa into your yard to reanimate it on turn 4. Because you played Overlord of the Hauntwoods on 3, Invasion on 4, Atraxa. I'm not really seeing too much of that. I think you're just kind of assuming that your guys will die. Your Planeswalkers will die, your Overlords will die to removal or whatever, and you just Invasion them back into play. But maybe I'm missing a trick. We'll see in just a second as I scroll back down. But yeah, this is just a really late game deck. You've got stuff like Overlord in here that helps you ramp. And Zur assumes that you'll actually be getting that attacks trigger a good bit. So maybe that's what the deck is doing. They're just ramping, a couple of times in a game with Overlord, playing multiple copies of Overlord and ramping that way. And then getting the Atraxa, the Kayas and stuff that way. I guess you can surveil. Yeah, you've got a 4/8 surveil lands in the deck, so if there happens to be an Atraxa on top, I guess you can do it that way, but it's not going to happen all the time, although it will happen sometimes. So, cool deck here. You just don't see Zur every day, and even though this is mostly a remnant of the Domain plan, I'm not sure how long it's going to stick around. I don't know if Domain will take a different course and still be a really popular deck, or if this version of the deck will take off, and we'll see some of the Domain-y remnants kind of drop off in favor of different cards in different slots. But I'm excited to see where it goes from here. Haven't seen Zur in a deck in a long time, and he's really cool with these Overlords. Last deck of the day now. I have labeled this one number 1 because if the criteria here is having brand new cards in it, this deck has the most brand new cards by far. It plays 38 non-land main deck cards, and 32 of those are Duskmourn cards. Brand new deck with tons and tons of brand new cards in it. So let's take a look at Azorius enchantments here. Another one that some of us thought might be okay, but weren't too sure was like going to be a good deck, tier 1 or anything like that. And I'm still not sure tier 1 is the right words for it, but this is obviously a powerful deck. It got a couple of decent results over the weekend, or at least the first few days of the season, right? Sapoa got 4th place with this deck in an MTGO challenge, but in that same challenge, GX7 got 7th place. So 2 top 8 finishes in the same most recent challenge on MTGO. So those are big results for a brand new deck. deck, and no other new deck outside of, say, Boros Mice or Mono Red Leyline got results like this over the first few days of the format. So let's take a look at it real quick. It's got Gremlin Tamer in it. That's the card we're going to start on, and it turns out you can flood the board pretty easily in this deck. And a bunch of other decks that feature the card. I've seen some even lower curve versions of this deck, but we played plenty of 3s in this one, like Entity Tracker, which is a flash, enchantress that draws a card. It draws a card whenever an enchantment comes into play. That's a traditional enchantress, but this is the first one we've really seen with flash, and that is actually unbelievable. There's also Enduring Innocence, which can draw a card when it comes into play because of Entity Tracker, and then when it dies, it comes back into play and draws another card off of Innocence or Entity Tracker. And it also makes another creature from Gremlin Tamer, so that's a good 2-3 curve as well. Just a really good way of drawing cards, it works with Gremlin Tamer every way that you want it to. Gremlin Tamer gets a 1/1 when it comes into play, and then because you got a 1/1, you get to draw a card. This is very, very disgusting. And then on subsequent turns, Gremlin Tamer will also make sure you draw plenty of cards off of Enduring Innocence, at least, the one a turn that it can trigger. Aside from that, Inquisitive Glimmer makes, things like Enduring Innocence, first of all, cost less mana, which is kind of important, but makes all of our auras and other enchantments and stuff cost 1 less, which is pretty big for a deck like this. And it's got decent toughness as well. Wears an Ethereal Armor nicely, right? We'll get to that in a second. Optimistic Scavenger is a 4-of, one of the only 1-drops in the deck, basically the only way we're getting on the board on turn 1. Which is surprising given a lot of the builds that I've seen of enchantments so far this season. People are playing like Ruin Lurker Bat and resorting to Armored Armadillo and like Toadstool Admirer, and I like that this build of the deck does not go out of its way to play cards that we would normally think are bad. I like Ruin Lurker Bat. I'm not sure about it for decks like this. As far as the auras and stuff that we're playing in the deck, the rest of the deck is all auras. We've got things like Fey Flight and Ossification. These are the only 2 older cards really in the deck. Ossification's just good removal, just solid removal, right? Counts as an aura, all that. And then Fey Flight. This is a neat one. There's a couple of different solutions I've seen to the sort of 2-drop aura in this deck problem. There's a card very similar to this in white that instead of giving the hexproof, it draws a card when it comes into play. And I've seen that one come up from time to time, but I think Fey Flight is obviously the better one. This way, we've got 8 different protection spells in the deck, and I think that's super important for a deck like this to have. This one gives the creature hexproof till end of turn, but it also gives the creature +1/+0 in flying. And flying's pretty important. If you just put it on like an Optimistic Scavenger or something, suddenly he's got pretty good power and flying. Ethereal Armor is in the deck. Yeah, Ethereal Armor is a card that I was really excited about. I played this a lot in paper in my Magic life, and it's a card that I've really liked in the past, and I was hoping it would do something in Standard, and it definitely has, bro. Hasbro, get it? Anyway, Ethereal Armor is making a huge impact, but so is Sheltered by Ghosts. This is in some ways the best card in the deck. In all the builds that I've played, Sheltered by Ghosts is a card that I'm always looking to draw, This is basically a removal spell against any non-land permanent, not just creatures, non-land permanent at all, which is insane. But it also gives the creature that you attach it to, you attach it to your guy, but it takes out one of their non-land things. But the creature you've attached to gives it +1/+0, has lifelink and ward too. So it's really hard to remove the creature at this point. And getting lifelink is nutty and kind of a mistake in a lot of ways, because you can make creatures huge with different auras and Optimistic Scavengers and Ethereal Armors, and lifelink is just a step too far in some ways. But Shard Mage's Rescue is also a brand new card from Duskmourn in here. This is just a single mana for a flash aura that enchants a dude you control. The guy gets +1/+1, and if it entered this turn, the enchanted creature has hexproof if Rescue itself entered this turn. So really, really cool, man. This just for a single mana puts an enchantment into play. So that's a Gremlin token off of Gremlin Tamer. That's a +1/+1 counter off of Optimistic Scavenger. You've drawn a card off of Entity Tracker, right? And you saved your guy. So saving Entity Tracker from a removal spell and drawing a card is often a really swingy move for just a single mana. But that's basically all I've got for this one. I know I'm kind of running over time, but there was a lot to talk about this week. And there was a bunch of decks I didn't talk about. There was Boros Mice. There was Mono Red Leyline, which is just kind of everywhere, even in best of 3. There was a Grixis Legends deck that did really well in one of the challenges. Is it Hellraiser has popped up, Capricious Hellraiser, a couple of times in these challenges. There's a lot of brand new stuff in Standard, and I get the feeling that's not all we're going to see before the smoke settles and the dust clears. So stick with the channel. We're going to do one of these videos every week in Duskmourn Standard like we normally do, and just kind of keep you primed as to what the best decks are every week, or the newest decks at least. But anyway, sub to the channel to make sure you get the videos when they come out. Make sure you like the video. It's the button shaped like a thumb. You can check out the Patreon if you want to reward my hard work and lots of effort and all that. You can see that there's true production polish on this series, right? You can throw $1 a month my way. Link in the description on that. I'd greatly appreciate it. But apart from that, just let me know how you felt about everything. Any decks you've seen out in the wild you thought were cool. Anything you're playing that you're having a lot of success with. You can tell us your secrets. It's okay, man. Anyway, that's all I've got for this one, though. So get down there in the comments and hit me up. But anyway, I'm Deb from the place, everybody. And I guess that's Allski Kowalski. I'll catch you cats later. Spread love and be kind.